New York, 1932. The city was quieter than people remembered, but far more dangerous. Prohibition was ending, alliances were shifting, and the men who survived weren't the loudest. They were the most patient. Frank Costello was one of them. He didn't rule from dark alleys or crowded bars. He ruled from back rooms where politicians loosened their ties and spoke honestly. He understood that power, real power, didn't come from fear alone, but from trust carefully engineered. Before we step fully into this story, let me say something the way Frank himself might have said it, without force, without urgency. We have a dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of this month. If you value stories grounded in real history, told with depth and respect, subscribe, leave a like, and be part of this dream. Now listen closely, because everything that follows began with a single laugh. The laugh came from Salvatore Mancini, a rising mob boss who mistook cruelty for authority. Mancini had muscle, territory, and a reputation for humiliating men to remind them where they stood. That night, in a private dining room hidden behind a midtown restaurant, conversation drifted toward family. Always a dangerous subject. Someone mentioned Costello's mother, an elderly Italian woman who lived modestly and avoided the world her son controlled. Mancini smirked, lifted his glass, and made a remark meant to entertain. It was sharp, dismissive, and unnecessary. The room fell quiet, not because of fear, but because every man there understood something irreversible had just happened. Frank Costello did not respond. He didn't tighten his jaw. He didn't glare. He didn't even look offended. He simply paused, folded his napkin carefully, and took a slow sip of his drink. His eyes met Mancini's for half a second, not with anger, but with calculation. To those who truly knew him, that moment was chilling. Costello was a man who believed insults revealed more about the speaker than the target. But when family was involved, he never forgot. He didn't believe in revenge fueled by emotion. He believed in consequences built quietly, brick by brick, until collapse became inevitable. Later that night, Costello returned home to a modest apartment far removed from the violence associated with his name. He helped his mother sit at the table, asked if she had eaten, and listened as she spoke about neighbors and small worries that meant nothing to the outside world. He never mentioned Mancini. He never mentioned the insult. He kissed her cheek before leaving the room, his expression calm, almost serene. Somewhere across the city, Salvatore Mancini was still laughing, unaware that his joke had already cost him everything, even if the bill had not yet arrived. In the weeks following that night, nothing appeared to change, and that was the most unsettling part. Frank Costello continued his routine as if the insult had evaporated into smoke. He attended the same dinners, shook the same hands, and spoke in the same measured tone about stability, progress, and the future of New York. To outsiders, he looked unchanged. But to those who had learned to read him, something subtle had shifted. Costello had begun to listen differently, not for threats or insults, but for weaknesses. He understood that men like Salvatore Mancini didn't fall because they were attacked. They fell because they were isolated. And isolation, in Costello's world, was engineered patiently, never announced. Mancini, meanwhile, mistook the quiet for victory. He bragged openly about how Costello had swallowed the insult, how the so-called prime minister of the underworld had chosen peace over pride. His men laughed with him, but their laughter lacked conviction. Some of them had been in that room. Some had seen Costello's eyes. They noticed small things first. Phone calls that went unanswered, meetings postponed without explanation, favors that suddenly require conditions. A trucking contract stalled. A union representative stopped returning messages. None of it was dramatic. All of it was deliberate. Costello never issued commands that could be traced. Instead, he had conversations. Over coffee with city official, he mentioned concerns about instability near Mancini's docks. At a charity fundraiser, he gently suggested that certain partnerships no longer felt reliable. With Lucky Luciano abroad and Vito Genovese maneuvering for advantage, Costello became the quiet center of gravity, the man others deferred to when uncertainty crept in. He never named Mancini as a problem. He simply spoke of order. And in a city addicted to order after years of chaos, that was enough. By the time Mancini sensed something was wrong, the ground beneath him had already softened. His lieutenants argued more often. His accountants complained about delays that made no sense. Every solution he tried led to another closed door. Still, he told himself it was temporary. Men like him always believed the system bent back in their favor. What Mancini didn't understand, what he would only grasp far too late, was that Frank Costello didn't bend systems. He rewired them. And once that process began, there was no shouting, no warning, no dramatic turning back. Only silence doing its work. The first real problem appeared so quietly that Salvatore Mancini almost ignored it. A shipment that was supposed to clear the docks in Brooklyn sat untouched for 2 days, then 3. No police raid, no explanation, just paperwork that kept circulating without resolution. Mancini stormed into his office, demanded answers, and was met with shrugs and nervous glances. Dock supervisors blamed new city regulations. Union men spoke about temporary complications. None of them looked him in the eye. That was when irritation gave way to unease. In Mancini's world, delays without threats were unnatural. Across the city, Frank Costello was having lunch with state assemblymen who owed him more favors than he could count. The conversation never mentioned Mancini by name. It didn't need to. Costello spoke instead about economic stability, about how unpredictable operators scared investors and attracted unwanted attention. He spoke softly, almost thoughtfully, as if weighing abstract ideas rather than shaping real outcomes. The assemblyman nodded, grateful for the guidance. When the lunch ended, Costello paid the bill, smiled, and left behind a city that would soon behave exactly as he expected. Mancini tried to compensate by tightening control. He leaned harder on smaller crews, demanded faster collections, and reminded his men who was in charge. But pressure revealed cracks rather than sealing them. One lieutenant asked an innocent question about protection routes and was answered with silence. Another quietly shifted allegiance, claiming he needed more reliable backing. Mancini felt the city changing around him, like a current pulling away from shore. The more he fought it, the clearer it became that he was no longer steering. Late one night, alone in his office, Mancini replayed the memory he had dismissed weeks earlier. Costello's calm face, the absence of reaction, the weight of that brief eye contact. For the first time, the laughter that had once made him feel powerful sounded different in his mind. It echoed too long, too hollow. Mancini poured himself a drink and stared at the glass, realizing that whatever had begun that night was not a feud. It was a process. And processes, once set in motion by men like Frank Costello, did not stop because someone finally understood them. By early autumn, Salvatore Mancini's name no longer carried the weight it once did. He noticed at first in the small things, a maitre d' hesitating before seating him, a politician's secretary claiming her boss was unavailable indefinitely, a familiar card game suddenly full before he arrived. These were not insults he could confront or punish. They were absences. In New York's underworld, absence was more dangerous than opposition, because it meant consensus had already shifted. Mancini began to understand that someone was moving the city without ever touching him, and that realization gnawed at him in ways gunfire never could. Frank Costello watched this phase from a distance, careful not to appear involved. He had lived long enough to know that collapse needed room to feel organic. Too much pressure would expose intent. Too little would allow recovery. So he balanced it precisely. At a closed-door meeting with business leaders and political intermediaries, Costello spoke about predictability, about how reckless personalities threatened delicate arrangements. He framed his words as concern, not accusation. Heads nodded. Notes were taken. Decisions followed. Mancini was not excluded by decree. He was excluded by agreement. Desperation drove Mancini to mistakes. He tried to force meetings, arriving unannounced where he once had open invitations. He offered better terms, then harsher ones. Each attempt reinforced the same conclusion among those watching him. He was unstable. That label, whispered carefully, spread faster than any rumor. Stability was currency now, and Mancini no longer had it. The irony was brutal. The very arrogance that led him to mock Costello's mother now marked him as a liability. One evening, after yet another failed attempt to secure backing, Mancini sat his car outside a darkened office building and finally admitted the truth aloud. Frank Costello had never needed to threaten him. He had never needed to respond. By choosing silence, Costello had forced Mancini to expose himself. And as the city quietly turned its back, Mancini understood that his downfall was not approaching. It had already happened. The indictments, when they came, felt almost anticlimactic. Salvatore Mancini had expected betrayal to arrive loudly, with raids, headlines, or bullets. Instead, it arrived dressed in paperwork and polite language. Subpoenas, hearings, investigations that had clearly been prepared long before his name ever appeared on them. His lawyers assured him this was manageable, that every powerful man faced scrutiny now and then. But even they sounded uncertain. They asked fewer questions. They avoided eye contact. Mancini could sense that whatever protection once surrounded him had already evaporated. Frank Costello never appeared anywhere near the unfolding disaster. He didn't attend the hearings. He didn't speak to the press. He continued his days as usual, attending civic events, exchanging pleasantries with judges and businessmen, presenting himself as the embodiment of restraint. To those who understood the deeper currents of power, his absence was proof enough. This was how Costello operated. He allowed institutions to do what they were designed to do, once gently guided in the right direction. No blood, no spectacle, just consequence. Mancini's men began to disappear from his life one by one. Some were arrested, others claimed distance, insisting they had only minor associations. A few simply vanished into rival organizations, welcomed not for loyalty but for information. Mancini raged privately, smashing glasses, shouting at shadows, demanding names he could no longer punish. The city no longer feared him, and fear had been the only language he truly spoke. On the afternoon his bail was denied. Mancini sat in a holding cell and finally felt something close to clarity. This was not a war he had lost. It was a lesson he had failed. He remembered Costello's calm expression, the absence of anger, the quiet dignity with which he had folded his napkin that night. For the first time, Mancini understood the difference between men who ruled through noise and men who ruled through permanence. And that understanding came at the exact moment it could no longer save him. Among those who survived the old world and adapted to the new one, Frank Costello's name was spoken differently, not with fear, but with respect edged by caution. Men who studied power understood that Costello represented a rare evolution, a figure who had outgrown violence without ever disowning it. He knew where brutality belonged, but he also knew when it weakened the very structures it was meant to protect. The collapse of Salvatore Mancini became an unspoken case study, referenced indirectly in private conversations about what happened to men who confused dominance with discipline. Costello's closest associates noticed that he never celebrated Mancini's downfall. There were no toasts, no private jokes, no satisfaction displayed. When asked indirectly about recent changes in the landscape, Costello responded with vague observations about balance and responsibility. To him, what had occurred was not personal triumph, but correction. Systems, he believed, demanded equilibrium. Mancini had disrupted that equilibrium by mocking something sacred, family, and by doing so had revealed himself as incapable of restraint. Meanwhile, law enforcement analysts and journalists puzzled over Mancini's rapid decline. There was no single smoking gun, no clear villain behind the scenes. That ambiguity frustrated investigators, but protected Costello completely. His genius lay in making his influence indistinguishable from inevitability. Events unfolded as though no one had orchestrated them, even as every insider quietly acknowledged who had benefited from the outcome. In the end, Costello's greatest weapon was not intelligence or connections, but patience. He understood that time amplifies structure and erodes recklessness. Mancini had believed power was something seized in moments. Costello knew it was something accumulated in years. And that difference, subtle, invisible to the arrogant, was why he never needed to raise his voice. Silence, when mastered, was louder than any threat. As months turned into years, Salvatore Mancini faded from conversation the way outdated headlines fade from memory. His trial concluded without drama, his sentence reported in small print, his name spoken only when someone wanted to illustrate a mistake. New York had no patience for fallen men who lacked legacy. What lingered instead was the lesson. Younger operators, politicians, and intermediaries absorbed it quietly. There were lines you never crossed, and family was one of them, not because of sentiment, but because men who protected family with restraint protected everything else the same way. Frank Costello's influence, by contrast, became more pronounced precisely because it remained understated. He was consulted on matters that never made the newspapers: labor disputes, zoning decisions, political endorsements that shaped elections without appearing controversial. When Lucky Luciano's era receded and figures like Vito Genovese maneuvered aggressively for dominance, Costello positioned himself as a stabilizing force, the man whose approval meant legitimacy. His power didn't spike. It settled. It became part of the city's infrastructure. Occasionally, someone would mention Mancini's insult in hushed tones, always followed by silence. No one embellished the story. No one dramatized it. The simplicity was what made it terrifying. A joke, a pause, a ruin. Men who heard it understood that Costello's restraint was not weakness. It was calibration. He allowed others to destroy themselves by exposing their own excess. And in quiet moments, when Costello walked alone through neighborhoods that no longer questioned his presence, he reflected not on vengeance, but on continuity. Power, he believed, was only meaningful if it endured without spectacle. The city remembered him that way, not as the loudest voice in the room, but as the one whose silence reshaped it forever. Years later, long after Salvatore Mancini's name had been reduced to a footnote, the story still circulated among men who understood power. It was never told loudly. It was never exaggerated. It didn't need to be. The restraint in the telling mirrored the restraint of the man at its center. Frank Costello had gone on to survive assassination attempts, public trials, and shifting alliances that crushed louder, more violent figures. Through it all, his method remained unchanged. He never confused emotion with action. He never allowed anger to dictate timing. And he never struck where noise would follow. Those closest Costello eventually understood what that night truly represented. It wasn't about a mother being mocked. It was about a man revealing his character in a single careless moment. Mancini's mistake wasn't the insult itself. It was believing that power excused the absence of respect. Costello saw that flaw instantly. Where others might have responded with fury, he responded with structure. He placed Mancini back into the very systems he thought he controlled, and let them judge him impartially, efficiently, and without mercy. In his later years, Costello was often described as the last of a certain kind of ruler, one who understood that survival depended on adaptability, not intimidation. He had lived long enough to see the men who laughed the loudest fall the fastest. When asked once what separated leaders from fools, Costello answered with a quiet smile and a simple observation. Some men make noise. Other men make outcomes. No one needed him to explain further. And so the story ended the way it began, without shouting, without gunfire, without spectacle. A laugh was answered with silence. Silence became movement. Movement became consequence. Frank Costello never raised his voice. He didn't have to. In a city built on power, he understood the oldest truth of all. The bill always comes due, and the most dangerous men are the ones who decide when it gets paid.